Okay, we're going to take a look at a very popular game, For the People, the American Civil War, designed by Mark Herman. Now, the first edition came out in 1998 by Avalon Hill, and it was such a success that GMT picked it up and did a second edition in 2000. Some slight revisions were made, 20 new cards were added to the deck, and it was re-released in 2006 with a revised rule book, but incorporating much of the errata and Q&A that had accumulated over the years. It's a classic Civil War game. It's one of the best out in the market. It's hugely popular. It's a fan favorite at WBC. It's always featured as a tournament, and I suspect it will continue to be very popular for years. It's one of my favorite games on the Civil War. Now, having said that, I have some reservations about some of the history in it, and yet the game is quite capable of portraying Civil War fairly accurately too. But I have some little nitpicks with it, and I'm going to point out some of those and show you some of the map anomalies you have to be very wary of in play. So let's take a look at that, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, one thing that throws off a lot of people is the depiction of the river system. Now, here I have the board with no counters on it, but we're doing that to examine the Mississippi, for example. Now, at the mouth of the Mississippi, we have Forts St. Philippe and Jackson guarding the mouth of the Mississippi, guarding the port city of New Orleans. Now, the thing to remember about the river system is that the Union has total control of the water, unless the Confederates deny that control by the placement of a fort. So in this scenario, the fort here, Forts Philip and Jackson, do close the Mississippi to the Union. But if the Confederacy has no forts in the north here along the Mississippi, it's totally open from St. Louis down. So a Union player could move units all the way down the Mississippi, all the way to New Orleans from the rear if there are no Confederate forts. So forts are key to this game, very important. For example, if the Confederates had constructed a fort at Vicksburg, the Union would still have full Mississippi movement up to Vicksburg. They would not be able to move between New Orleans and Grand Gulf. This is key. The placement of Confederate forts is extremely important. For example, in our case here with the Confederate fort at Vicksburg, the Union would still have full river movement down the Mississippi and up the Arkansas. Only a fort, for example, the Confederate fort at Memphis, would deny them that control. In this example, the Union would have full movement search down to here, would not have any kind of movement allowed between these points and here and Forts Jackson and Philippe. Now, if the Union had successfully assaulted and captured Fort St. Philippe and Jackson, they would now have access to the Mississippi mouth and could move up to as far as, again, Vicksburg, would not have access to Little Rock, Arkansas, or the Arkansas River. So the placement of forts in this game for the Confederates is absolutely key. Now, one thing I do like that Mark has got absolutely right is the location of Forts Henry and Donelson and their importance in the campaign. Now, let's zoom in on that. Okay, with this closer view, we have show you the importance of the location of the historical forts Henry and Donelson. Now, Henry and Donelson were two Confederate forts that were actually on the Cumberland River here and the Tennessee River. Now, in For the People, these are combined into one fort at Dover, Tennessee. And even in game terms, we can see how important this fort really is. Because if the fort was not there, you can see the Union would have total riverine movement down the Tennessee all the way here to Decatur, Alabama. Now, that's very, very important in game terms. And so you see the construction of a fort at Dover denies this Union control. It also denies Union naval control into Clarksville and Nashville, again underlining the importance of forts in the Confederate defense system. So when Grant took Forts Henry and Donelson, and open this up, you can see the peril that the Confederacy was in. This is why the Confederates eventually had to abandon or give up a lot of Kentucky because of that. With the Union ability to go in their rear, they had no choice but to fall back. So the use of forts in this game accurately shows the way they were actually used in the Civil War. You can also see the importance of Pittsburgh Landing. This is where Grant, of course, was attacked at the Battle of Shiloh. And with his back to the river, though, he's just fine. He doesn't have to worry about anything. With his base at Cairo, as long as the Union Army is adjacent to a river, they're perfectly fine. And even in game terms, if a Confederate strength point was here at Dover or one at Paducah, Kentucky, it doesn't bother the Union supply line at all because he's supplied by water. Only forts interdict the Union supply line. And you can also see the importance of the fort here at New Madrid, which was island number 10. That was captured by Pope very early on in the war, and an important fort it was. Again, with no fort here at New Madrid, island number 10, the Mississippi is open. So in game terms, you'll often find the Confederates building forts at Memphis, or perhaps island number 10, and certainly down there eventually at Vicksburg. So this part of the video is mainly to show you the importance of forts, and I'll show you a couple of other examples where forts are quite key in the game. Now, Confederate forts that are printed directly on the map are usually opposite blockade runner ports. Here's a good example of Fort Sumter and Charleston. Now we all know that Sumter is actually just outside the harbor of Charleston, and as long as the Confederates hold the fort at Charleston is perfectly secure. But should the Union ever capture Fort Sumter, then the port is closed for blockade running. Again, showing you the importance of forts. Now in the game, the Confederate is only allowed to garrison the coastal forts with a strength point of 1. But Mark has constructed the combat results table very cleverly, and it works. At first you look at the combat results table and it looks kind of indecisive with a lot of 1s and 2s. There are some 6s here on the higher tables, but I've studied this table carefully, and Mark maintains that it does accurately reflect Civil War battles casualties, and I tend to agree with him. It takes getting used to this table, but once you get the hang of it, you really see how it works. You see how brilliant it really is. So that table works perfectly well with the fort rules. So when the Union does capture a fort, the port is closed. Now I might point out that if a Confederate fort is not garrisoned, let's say we have a fort here at Nashville. This took me a bit by surprise because the rules state that forts actually represent the garrison and the guns holding about 5,000 men. So I kind of assumed they at least defended themselves against a land attack, but they do not. So if a Union force was to move into Nashville, let's say here from the rear, not by water, they capture the fort automatically, and the fort is removed from the board. That took a bit of getting used to. I would have thought there'd at least have to be a battle there, but there isn't. So that was a little game anomaly that I was a little uncomfortable with, but I can live with it. Now, not only are forts important, but Union naval control is of supreme importance when there are no forts. Now, I did mention that the Union has total control of, let's say, the Tennessee here with no Confederate forts. But even worse for the Confederates is if there are no Confederate forts, the Confederates do not have the ability to cross the Tennessee River. And that can have disastrous consequences in game terms, as it did in history. Like I said, when Fort Henry and Donelson fell, the Confederate front was immediately pushed back hundreds of miles. Now in game terms, this force at Mackenzie here, Confederate, may not move to Dover because it's crossing the Tennessee River, something it's not allowed to do. Also, it means the Confederates could not even move here to Pittsburgh Landing and cross. Again, Union naval control. So in game terms, with the Union in control of the Tennessee, a Confederate force would have to march all the way around here, down to Tuscumbia, Decatur, and then up this way if it wanted to reinforce Nashville. So you can see the physical isolation that the Confederates have to deal with if the Union gains river control. River control is key in this game. Very, very important. Also, the rivers, if held by the Union, protect their defenses. For example, Cairo here, Illinois, is virtually an impregnable position because the Confederates cannot cross the Cumberland River here. They cannot move from Paducah, Kentucky to Cairo. The only way they could do that is to build a fort. And when you build a fort, you negate the Union river control. So if the Confederates did build a fort at Paducah, they would be able to move from Paducah to Cairo. But keep in mind that in game terms, in order to build a fort, the Confederates must use a 3 card, and those are very precious. So it would take a 3 card for the Confederates to build a fort. And on top of that, there's only a limited number of forts in the game. The Confederate only has 6 of them. It's the maximum number of forts the Confederacy can build. And that takes a bit of getting used to, but I must admit, it's a good rule and I really like it. Shows you the expense it would cost the Confederacy to build stuff like that. They just didn't have the resources to build forts and fortifications the way the Union did. By the way, the Union player, by the way, can build forts with a 1, 2, or 3 card, and he has much more forts at his disposal. So that's a bit about forts and river control. Well, while I'm at it, I might as well show this sneaky move, because this is one that caught me by surprise when I was learning the game, is the key fort here, Fort Gadsden in Florida. As you can see, it's a coastal fort, which Confederates own, and the red arrow indicates that it's a blockade runner port. But what caught me off guard when I first played the game was I didn't really notice the little ship symbol here at Columbus, which means Columbus is the port for the fort at Gadsden, Fort Gadsden. Thus, and here's the ugly part, if the Union gains control of Fort Gadsden, they close down the port of Columbus. And if they capture it, they can move troops by water from Washington or any other port directly past Gadsden and right into the Confederate rear here at Columbus, Georgia. So the Confederate player has to be very wary of his coast. And that's completely accurate. That's one thing I like about the game. Some might say that the naval rules aren't detailed enough. Well, I can tell you that they're very accurate. Anyone who's read Jefferson Davis's book, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, will know that the Confederacy was very, very jealous and in apprehension about their coastline. They just had thousands of miles of coastline to protect, and they just didn't have the resources to do it. Another good book on the Civil War is Rowena Reed's Combined Operations in the Civil War. Again, I don't know if Mark consulted that book, but his game accurately reflects the total vulnerability of the Confederacy to attack by sea. So this game, while taking a little bit of effort to get used to and read those rules, accurately portrays the Civil War at sea. It's very well done that way. Okay, we'll take a look at the seniority system to some degree. Now let's say we have a situation here where the Army of Northern Virginia is commanded by Robert E. Lee, something we often see, and we have Stuart's Cavalry Brigade with the Army, and we have 2 subordinate leaders, Jackson and Johnson. Now, armies are allowed to splinter off. A corps can leave the army with other strength points. However, we have this kind of peculiar rule. I'm not sure why it's there because it kind of defies history. But anyway, the rule is the senior corps commander, the one with the most political seniority, cannot be the one detached from the army. So in this case, if Lee wanted to detach some strength points, it would have to be Jackson, not Johnson. In fact, Johnson was not allowed to be detached. I wasn't sure of the historical reasoning for that rule, but I haven't studied all the seniority values of all the leaders. Now, for example, let's say we had Jackson and Ewell in the Army. That would technically mean that the senior officer here is Jackson, and it would be Ewell that would be detached from the Army, and Jackson would not allow to be detached. And that kind of defies history for me, because if we have the classic case where Ewell and Jackson are together, let's say with Longstreet, because of the seniority rules, Jackson wouldn't allowed to be detached, which we know historically often Lee did detach Jackson for special duties outside of the Army in Northern Virginia. So that takes a little bit of getting used to. I can live with it because this is such a fine game, but that's just some of the historical anomalies that I wish I knew why were in the game. One thing I do like about the seniority system is when you're creating an army, you have to obey the seniority of the generals on the board, or else pay a penalty. So in this example, let's say we wanted to create the Army of Northern Virginia, and we had these 5 generals on the board. Well, let's say you wanted to have Robert E. Lee command the Army of Northern Virginia. You can do that, but you're going to pay a strategic will penalty if you make him Army commander over Albert Sidney Johnston. Why? Because Albert Sidney Johnston technically has seniority over Lee. So if you did do that, you'd lose 2 strategic will, but you would be able to put Lee in command of the Army. Now, the Union player, of course, has the same restrictions. So he's built in a whole seniority system into the game, which I think is, wow, it's kind of neat. You've got a lot in your mind when you're allocating and demoting generals and things like that. So this, again, is a rule where it follows history fairly well. There are some anomalies, as I mentioned, for the detachment of generals, but overall, I think it's very well done. Okay, now one of the very, very important rules in the game is the ability of an army to be able to convert spaces for political control as it moves. Now, generally, armies can move 6 spaces, but by paying 1 movement point, they can convert a space to its side, and that's critical for the advancing of armies. Now, this is a double-edged sword, because it can lead to some very gamey and kind of gross play. Let's show you the spirit of the rule, how it's supposed to work. For example, the Army of the Potomac, with 6 movement points, could move to Manassas Junction for 1 movement point, pay another movement point, leave a political control marker there, move to Fredericksburg, it's 3 movement points total, spend another movement point, convert it to Fredericksburg, and stop if it wished. So the Army has this ability to convert spaces in its rear as it advances, thus keeping its line of communications open. Perfectly reasonable rule, a good rule, and a rule that I'm wholeheartedly in favor of. And as in most Civil War games, we also have the ability to intercept. If the Army of the Potomac moved into Hanover Junction, the Army of the Northern Virginia, by looking at its leadership and rolling a die, would have the ability to possibly intercept the Union Army at Hanover, and a battle would be fought in the space. So that's how interception would work. But I was talking here about political control, and I've given you a very, very simple example of that control. Now, that also holds true for the Confederate, but let's show you a situation where the game can get a little hairy. Okay, now what I'm going to demonstrate now is a situation that the Union will never want to be in. Let's say, for example, the Army of Northern Virginia was activated under, let's say, Robert E. Lee. They can move to Harper's Ferry for 1 movement point, convert it. Well, actually, they don't have to convert it, it's already gray. But let's say that the Union previously had captured Harper's Ferry. We could have a situation kind of like this, where the Army of Northern Virginia would move to Harper's Ferry, 1, pay another movement point to remove that control marker, thus securing their rear, and go here to Chambersburg, convert that spot, putting a Confederate marker there, keep on moving. So it'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they're here at Gettysburg and converting the space. Now, one could argue, well, yeah, what's wrong with that? Isn't that the Gettysburg campaign? Well, yeah, it is. That's more or less what Lee's army did. But this can lead to some really bad abuses in the game. Now, let's say for the sake of argument, the Union had a hand of 1 cards. Now, the Army of the Potomac, half the time, usually has a 3 leader. And if you don't have any 3 cards, the Army of the Potomac isn't moving. Now, that can be disastrous. Now, that's what card-driven games are all about. You have to play your hand. The Union never should have let that situation occur in the first place. What I'm getting at, though, is there can be gross abuse in the sense that if the Union Army is unable to move or react to this, the Confederate then, in his turn, can keep on moving and thus sort of convert and this kind of thing. We could go to York, go 1-2, convert it, 3-4, convert it, Philadelphia, and 5-6 to Wilmington. Now, that's kind of an historical absurdity. The Confederate Army, even under Lee, couldn't possibly do a move like that. Now, each turn in the game represents kind of a season. And what does each card represent? Well, a card could represent weeks, could represent days. Card-driven games are usually abstract in that. We don't really know the time period. But you can get some very gamey tactics going on, this kind of thing. Now, yes, the Union player should prevent that kind of thing, but I'm just showing you what is possible in the game. And that's where the game deviates from history for me from a little bit. I mean, what is the Union Army doing in real life? Well, Lee's running roughshod all over York and Wilmington and Philadelphia. What are the state militias doing? What about Union naval power here? How would Lee's army possibly be supplied at such a distance, especially from Wilmington or Philadelphia? And historically, yes, the Confederates did get to Gettysburg and up near Harrisburg with 1 division, but it was a Herculean effort, and it took, the logistics of supply were strained, to say the least. In the Antietam campaign, he only got as far as Frederick. So I'm just pointing out some of the things you can do in the game that really take the game a little bit out of history. So that's where it fails for me a bit as a simulation. But as a game, it's fantastic. Now, don't send me tons of emails. I'm not trying to knock this game off its pedestal. I think this is one of the best Civil War games around. You just have to be aware of what armies can do and some of the abuses that can occur. And I'll give you another example here in the West. Okay, you'll remember me saying about the Union naval control and how the Confederates can't cross rivers if the Union has this control. Quite true. So, for example, the Ohio River here is totally dominated by Union gunboats. The Confederates are incapable of crossing the Ohio. Good rule. I think it's a great rule. But remember that fort rule. If the Confederates ever built a fort at, let's say, Louisville, Kentucky, on their next turn, they would be able to cross the Ohio. Okay? So the Union player always has to be aware of where Confederate forts are constructed. Now, granted, that's expensive. They would need a 3 card, but the Union has to be aware of that. Thus, if the Army of Tennessee had built a fort at Louisville and they got to move next, they would be able to move across the Ohio River, going to Bloomington, for example, spend a movement point, convert it to Confederate territory, move into, let's say, Vincennes, spend a movement point, convert it, and moving up to, let's say, Greencastle, and convert it. Thus you'd have a Confederate army here in Indiana. Now that's almost a historical absurdity too. The Confederacy just was not capable of sustaining armies that far from home. Certainly not through Kentucky, which was technically neutral, and back to the Confederacy. But we have to allow something for a game. This makes an excellent game. And again, if the Union is aware of that capability, he's going to make sure to block it. Keep the Confederacy so busy that they can't do that kind of thing. I just show it that to show you what can be done in the game, and where I think history is a little bit warped in doing so. Now, I think some raiders, I think under Morgan, did get across the Ohio. But we're talking about a raid of perhaps a regiment or so, 2 regiments, at most a brigade. But armies of the Confederacy were not capable of going into Indiana or Ohio. It's just one of the things in the game you have to live with to make it a good game. And like I said, this is a great game on the Civil War. Now, the final point I'm going to bring up is the card deck, and I'll tell you my concerns about that. Okay, now in any card-driven game, of course, the cards are going to determine everything. What you get in your hand is absolutely critical. Card management is critical. And in any good card-driven game, cards should drive the game and be one of the most important aspects of it. Now, Mark believes in doing a very wide-open game, and that's why some of his designs are the best in the hobby. Absolute best. For the People here is a classic. I think Empire of the Sun is a classic. Because they're wide open, that's why they are darn good games. But I'm doing the video here, again, as comparing it to history. And I'm a little bit more of a history guy, so I like to have a little bit more history in my games. Now, I'll give you an example of one of my little nitpicks that I don't quite like, and what I would have liked to see in For the People, or a variation of, and I'll get to that in a minute. Let's say, for example, well, in 1861, each side only starts with 4 cards. But if the Union got this card, or let's say the Confederates got this card, for example, draft riots in New York. So it's 1861, and the Confederate gets this card. Well, you know, because the game is wide open, of course the Confederate can play this card. And what it says is the Union must remove 3 strength points. If possible, strength points must come from Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, or Washington. Now, of course, this card is perfectly accurate historically. There were draft riots in New York in 1863 after the Battle of Gettysburg. In fact, Union units that fought at Gettysburg had the embarrassing position of having to go to New York and put down these riots. So that event is perfectly serviceable for 1863, but it is not possible in 1861. There's no way you can have draft riots in 61 when Lincoln is still calling for 75,000 men for volunteers. It was a volunteer army in 1861, and there was no draft. So this is a case where an event is out of its historical context, and I don't like that too much. You could also get something, let's say, like the Red River Campaign. Again, that would have been an event that the Union would have looked at perhaps in 1864. But in 1861, the primary thing on their mind was, of course, the defense of Washington and the fact that there was a Confederate army only 30 miles away. So that's where the open game concept hurts the game as simulation a bit. Now, in his other game, Empire of the Sun, most of his cards are, as I found out by learning the game from Mark himself, the titles of the cards are just for historical flavor. I mean, you really can use this as an operations card too, although this one has a special stipulation that if you don't play it for the campaign, the Union is going to lose 5 strategic will. But I do object to draft riots in 1861. Now, with a deck that size, how likely is that to happen? Well, it can happen, but that's card-driven games. That's the way they are designed, or the way Mark designed this one. Now, I would have preferred, and I'm not trying to redesign Mark's game, don't send me any emails. One guy, I think on Board Game Geek, did a nice variation. What he did was he divided the deck, I believe, into 3 decks, which I thought was kind of a neat idea. He did kind of an early war deck, a mid deck, and a late war deck, dividing, of course, the events into historical periods. And I haven't tried that variation, but it might make the game a bit more historical. For anyone who's played Mr. Madison's War, you'll know that the designer did it that way also. He did an 1812 deck, an 1813, and an 1814 deck. So that's kind of the way I look at things. I like it to be a little bit more historical. But that's all I have to say about For the People for the deck and the game itself. So let's do a summary here. Okay, For the People in summary. Well, like I mentioned, it's already been reprinted. It's in its 3rd edition now, and I believe it's on the P500 with GMT to go to a 4th edition. And I'd be very glad to see this fine game in print. one of my favorite on the American Civil War. I understand that Civil War, the old Victory Games game, is going to be possibly be reprinted with some revisions. So we should have a new Civil War game perhaps in the next year or so. But for the people, I think for many, it's going to be their favorite Civil War game, and indeed for many, their favorite game. Now, I did mention one thing I forgot to mention about the Naval was the amphibious and the Union naval blockade. Some people say that the naval rules are rather simple. I disagree. I think he's got it mainly in there. It worked quite well. Now, the Union naval blockade and the amphibious does depend on cards. True, but well, c'est la vie, that's the game. I think once, if you get the naval blockade working and amphibious working, the game is perfectly good at reflecting history. You can actually strangle the South. Now, the gaming experience for you might be different depending on who you play. If you're playing with a very, very experienced player, you're going to have a tough uphill battle because there's a lot of nuances about this game, a lot of subtleties that a new player to the game won't see at first. Now, as to play balance, I think it unquestionably is balanced for both sides because it's been a tournament at WBC for years, and I think the resident champion right now, James Pye, has won it several times over several years, and he's shown quite clearly that you can win as Union or Confederate. So in my opinion, it's a balanced game and a heck of a lot of fun. I think it's going to be people's favorite Civil War game for a long time. It's certainly one of my favorites. So I hope you enjoy the video. My video isn't, the objective is not to knock this game down. Again, don't email me telling me you hated the review or whatever. I like this game. It's a great game. But I do have concerns about it as history because I would have preferred a little bit more history in it. But there is history in it. It's very good at showing you the riverine movement and the way the game works. But just watch out for some gamey play. It can be tricky. Never lose Washington if you're Union. Never, never, never lose Washington. And close up the valley and make sure the Confederates can't get north of those rivers. And you'll have a heck of a time playing this game. Thank you for watching.